1945 to 1991, there was a geopolitical confrontation between the Soviet Union and its satellite governments and the United States and its allies. Between the two superpowers, the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union, there was an ideological struggle. The Cold War was mostly about the military might and nuclear arsenals of the two sides. In the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States had a deep mistrust of one another and were both adamant on winning. Political and military tensions, rivalry in the economy, espionage, and propaganda efforts characterized the Cold War. The Cold War's definition. From the middle of the 1940s through the beginning of the 1990s, there was geopolitical tension between the Soviet Union and its allies and the United States and its allies. In addition to the spread of nuclear weapons, it was marked by heightened military and political tensions, economic rivalry, and ideological conflict. B. Causes of the Cold War. 1. The Soviet Union's growing sway in Eastern Europe. 2. Both parties' development of nuclear weapons. 3. Attempts by the US and the Soviet Union to disseminate their philosophies. 4. Berlin's blockade by the Soviet Union. 5. US containment of the Soviet Union. 6. The Soviet Union's assistance to communist groups outside. 7. US participation in the Korean War. 8. The United States participation in the Vietnam War. 9. The Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. 10. US assistance to Latin American anti-communist troops. 2. The early years, 1945 to 1948. Potsdam Conference, 1945. The US, UK, and Soviet Union debate post-World War II Europe during a meeting. US forces deployed atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima in 1945. 1945, following World War II, the US and the USSR become the two superpowers. The Cold War officially begins in 1946, when Winston Churchill states that an Iron Curtain has dropped over Europe. 1946, the Truman Doctrine was declared, offering US help for nations under communist danger. 1947, the Marshall Plan was introduced, providing Western European countries with billions of euros in economic assistance. 1947, President Truman issues an order for US forces to enter the Greek Civil War. The US Air Force and the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, were founded in 1947, according to the National Security Act. Communist troops seized power in Czechoslovakia in 1948. In reaction to the Soviet Union's rising dominance, the US, UK, and France established the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in 1948. The development of ideological disparities. 1. Economic systems have different foundations, the United States, based on capitalism, and the Soviet Union, based on communism. 2. The two nations opposing ideologies, the United States was committed to democracy, while the Soviet Union was committed to tyranny. 3. Differing cultures, with the capitalist culture of the United States stressing individuality and the collectivist culture of the Soviet Union emphasizing state control. 4. Differing military alliances, the United States founded NATO, whereas the Soviet Union established the Warsaw Pact. 5. The United States and the Soviet Union have different objectives, the former wants to restrict communism, while the latter wants to promote it. 6. Disparate perspectives on nuclear weapons, the United States wants to stop the spread of nuclear weapons, while the Soviet Union wants to increase its nuclear arsenal. 7. Disparate approaches to foreign policy, the Soviet Union pursued a policy of confrontation while the United States pursued a détente strategy. BU.S. Soviet relations. Cold War ties between the United States and the Soviet Union were marked by a time of ferocious antagonism and rivalry between the two superpowers. Both countries pursued assertive foreign policies in order to expand their own spheres of influence and halt the development of each other's ideologies. This includes the development of nuclear weapons, proxy conflicts, and diplomatic impasses. With the deployment of intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Europe and the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cold War peaked in the early 1980s. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, the Cold War finally came to an end. 3. The Cold War's height, 1949 to 1962. Between 1945, when World War II came to a close, and 1991, when the Soviet Union fell, there was a time of intense hostilities between the United States and the Soviet Union. The two superpowers fought a number of proxy wars and nuclear arms races during this time, which increased international unpredictability. The Cold War's height, widely regarded to have occurred between 1949 and 1962, was characterized by an uptick in military rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. During this time, the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the founding of NATO and the Warsaw Pact all took place. During this period, there was a constant fear of nuclear war, and the globe teetered on the verge of destruction. Despite the fact that there was never a physical conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, the Cold War is remembered for its tension, paranoia, and long-term effects on global affairs. A. The space and arms races. Two of the most important Cold War developments were the arms race and the space race, 1949 to 1962. The United States and the Soviet Union engaged in an arms race to produce more advanced military hardware. Both nations achieved significant advancements in nuclear weaponry, developing and putting powerful atomic and hydrogen bombs to the test. The space race was a race between the Soviet Union and the United States to dominate space research. The first nation to put a person in orbit and launch a satellite into orbit was the Soviet Union. The US quickly imitated this, launching its own satellite and ultimately sending the first astronaut to the moon. Both nations made significant investments in satellite and rocket technology, which sped up the development of a number of the technologies we use today. The Cold War's two most important developments, the arms race and the space race, had a profound effect on the whole planet. B. The emergence of superpowers. The post-World War II era, when the United States and the Soviet Union first became the two major world powers, is known as the emergence of the superpowers. During this time, the two nations were more divided, with each one fighting for control and influence over the other. The Cold War, a time of tension and ideological conflict between the two nations that led to proxy wars and the development of nuclear weapons, marked this era. Along with the rise of the two superpowers, numerous nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America gained their independence as the old colonial empires fell apart. A new age in international affairs and a new kind of power struggle between the two nations also began with the birth of these superpowers. See alliance formation. The United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a fierce geopolitical competition from 1945 to 1991, known as the Cold War. During this period, both nations looked to join forces with other nations in order to obtain the upper hand on the global scene. These agreements aimed to advance each party's interests, increase their economic and military might, and establish a strategic balance of power that would avert all-out conflict. During the Cold War, the two superpowers forged two separate alliances. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a military alliance involving the United States, Canada, and a number of Western European countries, was established by the United States in 1949. In retaliation, the Soviet Union established the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance between the Soviet Union and its Eastern European allies, in 1955. In addition to these two major alliances, several minor partnerships were formed throughout the Cold War. By creating alliances with newly independent nations, the United States and the Soviet Union both aspired to increase their spheres of influence in the emerging globe. The Central Treaty Organization, CENTO, and Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, CETO, were both established by the United States in 1954 and 1959, respectively. Both the Warsaw Treaty Organization, WTO, and the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, COMECON, were established by the Soviet Union in 1949 and 1955, respectively. The alliances formed during the Cold War had a significant impact on the balance of power in the world and helped to avert a full-scale conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. These alliances helped to restrain the competition between the two superpowers and foster a stable international environment, despite the fact that they were often heated and unpredictable. The Fifth Cold War, 1963 to 1989. The United States and the Soviet Union, as well as their respective allies, engaged in significant ideological confrontation, military hostilities, and economic rivalries throughout the late Cold War, 1963 to 1989. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 as a result of the proxy wars, arms races, and contests for global influence that took place between the two superpowers and their allies during this period. Technology use increased during the Cold War, and there was a lot of work done to build nuclear weapons. Additionally, throughout this time period, there was a noticeable rise in the number of multinational enterprises and international organizations, as well as the formation of international non-governmental organizations. The Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty are only a few of the international agreements created as a consequence of the Cold War. The economies of the two superpowers, as well as the rest of the globe, were significantly impacted by the Cold War. A. Arms control and détente. The strategy of lowering tensions between the two Cold War superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, during the 1970s is referred to as détente and arms control. A number of significant agreements, such as the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF, of 1987, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty of 1972, and the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, agreements of 1972 and 1979, were signed as a result of this policy, which was first proposed in 1969 by U.S. President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev. As a result of these agreements, restrictions on nuclear weapons and delivery systems, as well as their mutual inspection and verification of disarmament provisions, the nuclear arms race and Cold War tensions were greatly decreased. Improved ties between the two superpowers were made possible by the détente and arms control agreements, which allowed for diplomatic visits and cultural exchanges between the US and the USSR. By lowering international tensions, détente and arms control helped bring the Cold War era to a close and usher in a new era of peaceful coexistence. B. Global emergencies. An international dispute that has the potential to worsen and have an effect on everyone on Earth is referred to as an international crisis. Political, economic, environmental, or military crises might fall under this category. Natural catastrophes, pandemics, and other occurrences with the potential to have a negative impact on the whole world may also be included. Depending on the situation and the parties involved, the extent and intensity of the global crisis might change significantly. It may sometimes result in interstate disputes or even war. In other situations, it may be handled diplomatically through talks, agreements, or other types of communication. Whatever the situation, global action is necessary to address international crises in order to stop further escalation and harm to the planet. 6. The end of the Cold War. When the Soviet Union fell apart in December 1991, the treaties and alliances that had existed throughout the Cold War were no longer in force. With the conclusion of World War II in 1945, a period of decades-long political and military tension between the United States and the Soviet Union came to an end. Causes of the end of the Cold War. 1. Fall of the Soviet Union. In 1991, the Soviet Union was dissolved, ending the Cold War's ideological struggle between capitalism and communism. 2. U.S. Soviet talks. A series of talks between the United States and the Soviet Union resulted in the signing of numerous significant pacts, such as the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty and the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. 3. The fall of the Berlin Wall. The Cold War officially ended in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell. 4. The rise of Gorbachev. When Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the middle of the 1980s, he instituted new policies, including glasnost and perestroika, that allowed for more contact between the Soviet Union and the West. 5. Improved US-Soviet ties. The Cold War was further ended by the Reagan and Bush administrations' improved relations with the Soviet Union. B. The effects of the Cold War. 1. Increased nuclear proliferation. The Cold War saw the development of nuclear weapons by the US, the Soviet Union, and 4 other nations, raising the possibility of nuclear conflict. 2. Expanded militarization and military expenditure. During the Cold War, both the US and the USSR increased their military budgets, which sparked a tremendous arms race. 3. The space race. During the Cold War, the US and the USSR battled it out to be the first to launch a satellite and a person into space. 4. Increasing paranoia, distrust, and mistrust between the two superpowers as a result of increased international tension brought on by the Cold War. 5. Proxy wars. During the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union sponsored opposing parties in conflicts all over the globe, resulting in proxy wars. 6. Political instability. Many nations, especially those in the Eastern Bloc, experienced significant political upheaval as a result of the Cold War. 7. The end of colonial rule. With the conclusion of the Cold War came the independence of several former colonies, which sparked a wave of decolonization. 8. The collapse of the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall's fall in 1989 is seen by many as a crucial moment in the end of the Cold War. 9. Cultural interaction. As the Cold War came to an end, East and West engaged in more cultural interchange, which improved understanding of other cultures. 6. Conclusion. The Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 marked the end of the Cold War. During the Cold War, the world's two superpowers gave way to a multipolar one. Increased collaboration between the former foes resulted after the conclusion of the Cold War, including the signing of agreements like the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty and the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. Additionally, it paved the way for deeper political and economic ties between the erstwhile Cold War foes. The conclusion of the Cold War also ushered in a new age of safety and stability for the whole world. A. An overview of the Cold War. Between 1945 and 1991, there was a time of high geopolitical tension and ideological confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both countries battled to export their different political and economic systems throughout the globe in an effort to gain international influence.